All right. So, hi, we're going to finish up kind of where we left up on Friday. So, on Friday, we talked specifically about the concept of the modern state. And so, the modern state being the idea that boundaries are fixed, that there are countries have sovereignty over their own territory, and boundaries are not fluid. Your people or your society is determined by your territory, not the other way around. And so, although we think of this as really like this makes sense to us, this is common, this is how we do things today, this concept is really relatively new in human history. And so, the state idea was diffused from its hearth in Europe to the entire world by 1900 through colonization. So, when we talk about historical diffusion, colonization comes up a lot. Colonization is a process that has caused the diffusion of culture, of ideas, of languages, of religions, really since the 1600s through really the middle part of the 20th century. So I do want to take a step back and make sure that we have a clear understanding of how the history of colonialism. We talked about it a little bit in our Unit 3, but we're just going to go over a brief history. Colonialism will be a big topic that you talk about in world history next year, whether you take regular or AP human or world history. But very brief history. When we think about the origins of colonialism, we can start in 1492 with the voyage of Christopher Columbus. And although Christopher Columbus is not an individual that we should celebrate due to some of the really horrific things that he brought with him, and that he, the atrocities that him and his people committed on their own, the voyage was significant because it also coincided with the printing press. And when Christopher Columbus came to the quote unquote New World, which was really the Caribbean, he originally thought he was actually in the East Indies, which he thought he was in like the islands off the coast of India, and eventually did realize that he wasn't there. But this spread. So the discovery, although it's not a discovery because people are already living there, but the discovery by Europeans of the continent of North and South America and the Caribbean islands was broadcast, was diffused. It was made known due to the fact that the printing press had also been invented, so that information was able to be spread much faster. Just like the internet today spreads information much faster, the printing press was kind of a similar invention of the time. And so with that, it did spark this age of discovery. And the age of discovery began with Portugal and Spain. So Portugal and Spain, it also coincided with technology in terms of shipping that were allowing groups of people to navigate large distances across the ocean. And the goals of colonialism were very much resources. So gold was most people thought that they were gonna discover gold in North and South America. Gold was not necessarily hugely profitable. And many groups did not find gold, but they did discover that there were resources, agricultural resources, other types of resources that could be extracted from colonies. The other goals of colonization was religion, so the spread of religion through missionaries, and just the fact that at the time, expanding your territory was going to give you more power. So with that, in the 15th and 16th century, so 14 and 1500s, Portugal and Spain really led the way in North and South, in particularly Latin America. And then by the 16th and the 17th century, England, France, Netherlands also established overseas empires. They did that also just because of the weaponry that had developed in Europe and that hadn't diffused yet, or that hadn't been developed yet in North and South America. They also had horses, which was something... The horses didn't exist in North and South America until the Europeans brought them over. So a couple of just other kind of geographic luck, or just like ways in which the advancements had progressed at that time, were allowing them to take over large portions of land and people. So when we take a look at the first wave of colonization, we are really thinking about starting late 1400s into the 1700s. and most North and South America were colonized by these countries at that time. And then we go through the first era of decolonization. So obviously we know that the United States gained its independence in 1776. Mexico gained its independence in the early 1800s. And many countries throughout Latin America and North and South America decolonize. So decolonization is independence movement. So many American colonies or countries gained independence by the mid 1800s. Then in the late 1800s, the Industrial Revolution, which was a shift away from agriculture to factories, is going to spark new imperialism. And it's going to happen at much faster speeds than it did in the original wave of colonization. And it's also going to just spark a need of resources. So the Industrial Revolution began in Great Britain. And Great Britain, although it had the factors that led to industrialization, they didn't have the vast amounts of resources. And so European countries are going to be looking to other continents, other countries, other regions of the world in order to power its industrial revolution. And this is going to lead to the second wave of the second wave of colonization. So the second wave was really focused on Africa. It was focused on Southeast Asia. And we're going to be talking more about the Berlin Conference, but the Berlin Conference was in the late 1800s, where Europeans really did go in and draw the boundaries that we know, many of the boundaries that still exist in Africa today, and divided them up into colonies. After World War I, the losers of World War I, particularly Germany, had to give up their colonies. And after World War II, we see the second phase of decolonization. So if we take a look at the number of colonies worldwide, we see from 1500 to the 1800s, we see this first wave of colonization that was mostly focused on North and South America. And then we see this area of decolonization. So not very many colonies existed between 1800 and 1825. Many countries became independent. And then we see the second wave of colonies, so the number of colonies and then we see after World War II, 1950 here, 1975, most countries then become independent. And we really don't see the true colonies anymore today, but we see many ways in which the control over regions of the world still exists. And we're going to call that neo-colonialism, as we'll define on a further slide. So I've shown you this map before, but you should have a little bit of a sense of the countries that were colonizing and the countries that were and the regions of the world that they were colonizing. And so this is Spain. So the yellow is Spain, the green is Portugal. We know that Catholicism, we know that Spanish was diffused through these processes. We have France here, we have and then now we have this independence movement. But now we see the edges of Africa turning into colonies, and then we eventually see by the Berlin Conference, we see pretty much all of Africa is going to be a colony. The two countries that were not colonized during the Berlin Conference were Ethiopia and Liberia. Then we also see, once again, the second phase of decolonization. So this map will kind of go through one more time. So we have 1492. We have the colonization of North and South America. 1600 here. 1660. 1754. So we have we're almost independent. Here we are an independent country. Then we start to see 1822, 1885, and then the Berlin Conference, which then divides up Africa into the colonies. And we see Southeast Asia as well. We also see Japan as a colonial power. So we see Japan controlling Korea and also portions of China. So Japan was also a colonizing power, particularly in East Asia. All right. So going back to that, this is also a map. You may want to pause this and take a look at this map, but this is a map of the dominant colonial influence over 4 centuries. So that first map was kind of moving throughout time, but on this map, we see the regional influence. So we see the influence of, for example, Great Britain over Canada and the United States, and many countries in Africa, as well as India and Pakistan, were controlled or colonized by the British. We see Australia as a British colony. We see Japan as a colonizing power over here in East Asia. We see the French West Africa, so French countries of West Africa. Nigeria is also British, as we know. They do speak one of their official language, or their official language is English. And we see the Spanish influence, the Portuguese influence, but having this little bit of a sense of knowledge of which countries colonized can help us understand the cultural landscapes. It can help us understand the connections that these countries still have, even to their former colonizers. So dates of independence, this is going to be the countries that are in the kind of the darker green or even the lighter green were had independence pretty early on, whereas the rest, the yellow countries, were independent after 1940, so after World War II. And then when we think about some of the largest influence of colonization, we do think of the British Empire, we think of the UK. And the UK, or the British Empire, or England, or whatever you want to call it at this time, had everything that you see in pink here are territories that were once part of the British Empire. And so the phrase goes that the sun never set on the British Empire. The sun never set on the British Empire because they had colonies all over the world, in all portions of the world. So as the sun, as day becomes night and night becomes day, that there was always some portion of the world that was in daylight, that was controlled by the British Empire. And one of the reasons that English has, not the only reason, but one of the reasons that English has diffused all over the world is because it was brought to the British colonies through the process of colonization. So there are, many people within India, for example, that speak English just due to the fact that it was colonized. And obviously the United States speaks English, and the United States is kind of a more of a world power post World War II, also contributes to the fact that English is spoken, but obviously the United States is an English-speaking country due to colonialism. All right, so the last piece that we're going to talk about here, and then you're going to be watching a video, is neocolonialism. So you do need to write this term down into your notebook. So neocolonialism. Neocolonialism just means new. Okay, so we talked about neo-Malthusians as new Malthusians, or new. So neocolonialism is new colonialism. And so neocolonialism is the use of economic, political, cultural, or other pressures to control or influence other countries, especially former dependencies. So there are very, very few colonies that exist anymore today. There are some territories, we don't necessarily call them colonies anymore, but there are territories. So for example, Puerto Rico is a territory of the United States, or the American Samoa is a territory. So we do still have territories or protectorates, or whatever we want to call them, but very few actual colonies really exist anymore today. However, there is the theory that although countries are independent, they're still very much dependent, or very much tied to their former colonies through economic, political, cultural pressures or relationships. So this very much connects with world systems theory. So if you remember back to world systems theory, the world systems theory was a dependency theory. And the dependency theory is very much tied to this colonialism or neocolonialism, where the core countries, most of the core countries were former colonizers, whereas the periphery countries are oftentimes former colonies. And the dependency relationship between the periphery and the core, whereas the core oftentimes exploits the periphery and the periphery is dependent upon the core, is this concept of neocolonialism. So the three basic tenets of world systems theory is that the world has one market and a global division of labor. And we'll get a little bit more into economic relationships later. But the other key thing is that although the world has multiple states or multiple countries, almost everything takes place in the context of that world economy. All relationships, nothing happens in isolation. And neocolonialism is that control by a powerful country of its former colonies or less developed countries by economic pressures. And then the world has a three-tier system: the core, the periphery, and the semi-periphery, as we've talked about in the past. So here's our map. You can see that many countries that were former colonizers, whether it be in Europe or North and South America, or maybe had very much were early colonies of the British. So like Australia, But Japan, as a colonizing country, is also considered to be a core country. And so you're going to be watching this video. So it says 8 minutes. It talks a little bit more about colonialism. It's interesting. It talks specifically about how China now has become a little bit of a neo-colonial power. So this is, once again, Mr. Sin. So you're going to watch this video and then you'll be doing something with that afterwards.